Hi, and welcome to a new mechanical watch movement review video. This is the third one I have done. I have already done a review about the Seiko NH or 4R series, mainly about the NH35 and 36. And I've also done a review video about the Seagull ST36. Links to both videos are both in the description and now in the top right corner of this video. But this video is about the Miyota 8200 series, which is a close competitor to the Seiko NH series. The Miyota 8200 series is one of the most common mechanical and automatic watch movements today. It is one of the most widely used and competes in the same niche sort of with the Seiko NH or 4R series of movements. Obviously there are more popular movements, I would say, in the more inexpensive price range of watches. There are also ETA movements and Celita movements, but they sit at a slightly higher price point, and that's why they are not, in my opinion, they are not really comparable to a Miyota 8215 or 8200 for that matter. To get some basic facts out of the way, Miyota is a subsidiary of Citizen actually, and that's why movements used in Citizen watches are actually Miyota movements. They build movements for third parties who are openly available on the market and to small micro brands and third-party brands to build their watches, but they are mostly used in Citizen watches and they power pretty much all mechanical Citizen watches. Miyota movements have a pretty decent track record. They're pretty well known for their longevity and their durability. They can easily be serviced and easily be regulated. Parts are also readily available, so this is one of the most easiest to work with movements on the market today, which speaks to its popularity. The Miyota 8200 series consists of the 8200 movement, the 8210, the 8215, and the 8205. And in this video we will look at the example of an 8215 movement, but all of these movements are pretty much more or less the same, and it's pretty much the same as with the Seiko movements, where the 35, the 36, and the 34 all have different characteristics. Although the base movement in all of these cases is the same movement, and this also is true for the Miyota. The movement is rated by Miyota with a accuracy per day of -20 to around +40 seconds, and the posture difference should be under 50 seconds. The movement has a power reserve of 42 hours. This is what it's rated with, and the frequency is 21,600 vibrations per hour, which is sort of in the mid-range, and it's not a super slow movement, but it's also not a 28,000 VPH movement, which probably speaks to the age when this movement was firstly designed. The movement has 21 joules, and well, the lift angle is 49 degrees. This is just something that you have to know if you want to put the movement on a time grapher. Other than that, it doesn't say really anything about the movement. The movement has hand winding and a hackable second, which means that if you pull the crown, the second hand stops because the balance actually stops. And the movement also has a quickset date function. The movement is actually a pretty small and slim movement. You can build pretty slim watches with it, which in my opinion is good. The fact that the movement does not have an impressive diameter more or less means that this movement usually does not look very good in cases with a glass case back. When the watch is sort of 40, 42, 45 millimeters in diameter, then the movement, if you can see the movement looks actually pretty small and dainty. Yeah, and that's basically it for the facts of this movement. This movement is not the youngest. The base design of the movement is quite some years old. I think at this point it's around 30 years old, depending on where you draw the line. And there are some things with this movement who have evolved, but in earlier movements, these things are actually quite tricky. And unfortunately, these are not so much things of durability. These are more sort of things that could be described as usability or as interface sort of issues. Something that especially older movements of this series have is a sort of stuttery, sort of sticky seconds hand. And what I mean by that is that it seems, if you're looking at the seconds hand, it seems that it is jumping a little bit and it's not consistently moving. And this has to do with the way this movement was originally constructed, and that means that in this movement the center seconds hand is indirectly driven. The center second hand is on a pinion on its own, and it's indirectly driven by the drivetrain of the watch, and that sort of produces, especially in combination with not perfect tolerances, produces this sort of stuttery or sort of jumpy, sticky seconds hand. This is something you don't see in Seiko movements because they are just constructed differently. And the indirect driven seconds hand is sort of a pretty traditional way of construction that is not really done today anymore, but it is an integral part of the movement design and therefore cannot be easily changed without basically designing a whole new movement. And that's why it is still found in the watches today. However, in current production movements, this problem is not as bad as it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, simply because of the fact that tolerances have become a lot tighter and therefore things work just a little bit better. The second thing that is not really pleasant about this movement is the hand winding. Well, the movement has a hand winding function, which is great, which for a very long time Seiko movements did not have, but it feels sort of, it does not feel great, let's put it that way. And that mostly is because if you hand wind the watch, you move the entire automatic group right up to the coupling wheel with the hand winding, and this causes a lot of friction and produces a lot of sound, and this is something that does not feel pleasant or high quality at all. And unfortunately also the click that is normally on a wheel directly above the barrel is not on the barrel itself in this movement. It is basically another wheel deeper in the movement. So if you wind it, you don't get the direct feeling of the click and the click spring, and what you end up with is a sensation or an interaction with the watch that is not perfect. I would even go so far as to say it's very far from perfect. It's very unpleasant. Here you can hear what the movement sounds if you hand wind it. It's sort of kind of a squeaky, high-pitched noise, which is not exactly that pleasant, but it does its job, and it's also a automatic movement, so you don't have to hand wind it if you don't want to. But nevertheless, it is a proven system, it works consistently, it doesn't cause any problems, and this movement, despite its low price point, has hand winding. Another thing that could be criticized about this movement is the fact that the automatic group in this movement, or the automatic mechanism in this movement, is unidirectional, which means that it only winds in one direction. And that is not bad in itself, it just means that it is a little bit less efficient. But what that does as a side effect is that the rotor spins freely in one direction. And when the rotor spins freely in one direction, there's nothing to break it. It basically keeps going until gravity stops it. And what that does is it produces rotor sound. And if you hit the movement in the wrong way, and I try to demonstrate that here, what you actually can hear is not the spinning rotor, but it's the spinning rotor bearing. I'm pretty sure that this has nothing to do with the quality of the bearing itself. It has more to do with the fact that nothing stops the rotor from spinning. So what I'm trying to say is that if you would have a unidirectional rotor in a Seiko movement, which you don't have right now on the NH35 and 36, they are bidirectional, you would probably hear the same spinning. So this has nothing to do with quality, this has just something to do with the way the watch was constructed. And that is, although a simpler mechanism and therefore probably less prone to breaking and wear, nevertheless it produces an unpleasant side effect. And people complain about rotor noise and always ask with Miyota movements, can you hear the rotor, can you hear the rotor? And sure, you can hear the rotor, but that has nothing to do with quality of the bearing or the rotor bearing. That has simply to do with how the watch is constructed, unfortunately. Other than that, the watch is fairly well constructed. It has 21 jewels. Today you could go with even 2 more jewels, which would be, well, favorable. I would say. And what we don't have is jewels on top and the bottom of the barrel. And this is something that Seiko has, unfortunately, which probably has to do with the fact that Seiko movements in the past were known for worn main barrel bearings, and that's why they probably replaced it. I don't know that Miyota movements had the same problem in the past. What they have now is they don't have those two extra jewels, and that does not seem to be a problem, but it's also sort of subpar standard for the current time. Another thing to note maybe is the fact that we have one or two, I can't exactly tell, plastic parts in the date setting mechanism. That's nothing bad. You have that also in Seiko movements. This is really not something bad or terrible or cheap or anything. And these parts are precisely used in a position where there is not a whole lot of wear, and they don't directly have to do with the timekeeping. These parts just have to deal with the date setting. And in my opinion, plastic is probably even favorable because it's less prone to breaking. If you would make the same part out of steel with a small steel spring and you sort of get a little bit of rust on it or a little bit of wear, or you use it in the wrong direction, it's pretty easy to break, I would say. And I think plastic is actually the more rigid solution here. So, what is my conclusion about this movement? It's a little bit tough. I recognize that it's a good movement in general. It's pretty precise, it's relatively inexpensive, so it's definitely not an overpriced movement. It struggles with problems of its history, I would say, to some degree, and it lacks a little bit of innovation, maybe. But to fix that, the solution probably really would be to design an entire new movement, and I don't know if that new movement then would be as cheap as this movement would be. I don't own a watch with the 8200 series, so I can't tell how it feels on the wrist itself. Just from handling the movement, it is not as pleasant and it does not feel as well as a Seiko NH or 4R movement, I must say, unfortunately. I would say quality-wise or value-wise, it's a little less. It sits underneath the Seiko NH 35, 36 or 4R 35 and 36 movements, but I wouldn't go so far and say that it is overpriced or trash or whatever. And I don't think that the movement does not perform well. But if you buy a Citizen watch for $200 or $300 with this 8200 movement in it, I don't know if it is that much of a good deal than a Seiko for the same money would be with a 4R movement. It is certainly not a terrible or bad movement. I mean, this movement has, I believe at this point, 30 years of track record. I guess that is my conclusion. But I'm very interested about your opinion on this movement, if you have experience with this movement on a watch. So feel free to write a comment down in the comment section. I'm really happy to hear from you. And there will also be a time grapher video about this movement so that we can see a little more about the performance of this movement. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on new videos in the future. And you can also follow me on Instagram for more content. You find the link for Instagram in the video description. If you have any watchmaking related questions, or if you have any ideas for future videos, feel free to comment them in the comment section down below. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the next video again.